In a small Ohio town, there is a parking lot next to the wastewater treatment plant. The city uses it to store equipment. People drive past it every day without a second thought. And buried underneath that lot, about 120 feet from the Great Miami River, sealed under a concrete barrier 10 feet thick, is a nuclear reactor. Not the memory of one. Not a plaque where one used to be. The actual reactor vessel, still in the ground, still radioactive, monitored to this day by the United States Department of Energy, and scheduled to be watched over, in effect, forever. This town of about 20,000 people once ran its own nuclear reactor. The first nuclear power plant of any kind in America to be operated by a municipal utility, a town's own power company, splitting the atom. For a few proud years in the 1960s, Piqua, Ohio, called itself the Atomic City. The government has a specific word for what was done to that reactor when the dream ended. It was not removed. It was not hauled away. It was entombed. The reactor buried there was unlike almost any other ever built in the United States. It was not cooled by water the way nearly every reactor is. It was cooled by oil, a heated, oily chemical with a commercial brand name. And the strange properties of that oil are both the reason the town believed it had caught the future, and the reason the future lasted barely 3 years. We will come back to the oil. To understand how a small town ends up with its own reactor, you have to remember what nuclear power meant in the middle of the 1950s, because it was almost the opposite of what it means now. It was not a fear. It was a promise. The single brightest promise in America. The phrase everybody repeated in those years was that atomic electricity would soon be too cheap to meter. And the federal government believed in that promise and wanted to prove it. Through the Atomic Energy Commission, it created something called the Power Reactor Demonstration Program, whose entire purpose was to fund partnerships between the government and local utilities so that working civilian reactors could be built and shown off across the country. It was, in effect, a nationwide invitation. Who wants to help build the future? And little Piqua, Ohio, raised its hand. In 1956, the city's director of municipal utilities, a man named John P. Gallagher, proposed that Piqua join the federal program and build its own reactor. The following year, Congress set aside roughly $11.5 million for the project. Ground was broken in 1959. Sit for a moment with the sheer confidence of that decision. A town of 20,000 people running its own small municipal power company looked at a technology that until then belonged to national governments and enormous utilities and decided that it too would generate electricity by splitting atoms. The reactor reached its first test operation in 1961. Uranium arrived in 1962. And in 1963, it achieved criticality and went fully operational. Steam produced by the atomic reactor was piped across the Great Miami River to the municipal power plant, where it spun the turbines and fed directly into the town's electrical grid. At its best, it supplied as much as a fifth of all the electricity in Piqua. The town embraced it completely and gave itself the nickname, the Atomic City. For a genuine moment, a small Ohio community was living inside the shining nuclear future that the entire country had been promised. Now, why here and why this particular design? Because that is where the story turns strange. Piqua's reactor was not just any reactor. It was chosen as a demonstration of a specific and unusual idea. Almost every reactor is cooled by water held under enormous pressure, and that pressure is a problem because it requires massive, heavy, expensive containment to keep the superheated water from instantly flashing into steam. Piqua's reactor avoided all of that by using a completely different coolant, an organic one. A mixture of hydrocarbons called terphenol, sold commercially under the name Santowax, which is essentially a heat-tolerant oil. Its great advantage was that it did the job at low pressure, and low pressure promised to make the entire plant simpler, lighter, and cheaper to build. That was the bet Piqua was helping to test. A reactor cooled more like an engine than a boiler. And none of this is obscure legend, which matters, because it is what separates this from a tall tale. It is documented by the Atomic Energy Commission's own program records, by newspaper coverage at the time in the Dayton and Cincinnati papers, by the histories kept by the American Nuclear Society, by a detailed engineering record held at the Library of Congress, and today by the Department of Energy's own Office of Legacy Management. The government's files, the local press, and the engineering historians all describe the same atomic city. For more than a year, the bet looked like it was paying off. The reactor ran smoothly, more or less exactly as the engineers had predicted. And then, in 1965, the operators noticed that the control rods were beginning to stick. And when they shut the reactor down to look inside, they found something growing in it. The very oil that was supposed to be the plant's genius had quietly become its undoing. Here is the problem every reactor has to solve. The core produces tremendous heat, and something has to carry that heat away in order to make steam. Almost everyone used water. Piqua used terphenol, the oily organic coolant, because it moved heat well while staying at low pressure, which meant the plant could skip the heavy, costly pressurized armor that water-cooled reactors demand. On paper, it was genuinely elegant. Cool the reactor with oil instead of water, and you could build the whole thing lighter and cheaper. But organic chemistry does not love radiation. That is the flaw, and you can understand it entirely through its effect. Inside an operating reactor, the core sits in an intense field of radiation, and radiation breaks chemical bonds. The hydrocarbon coolant circulating through that radiation at high temperature slowly began to come apart and recombine into heavier, stickier compounds. It polymerized. The oil that was supposed to flow cleanly through the core started, molecule by molecule, to turn into something closer to varnish. After running well for over a year, in 1965, the reactor began to show its trouble. The control rods, which are the very devices that regulate and, when needed, shut down the nuclear reaction, started to stick in place. In January of 1966, the operators shut the reactor down to investigate, and inside they found their answer. A large deposit of that polymerized coolant, a film, a gummy buildup of degraded oil, had formed on the fuel cladding, the thin metal skin wrapped around the nuclear fuel itself. The plant's single defining feature had quietly fouled its own core. Now, it is important to say clearly what this was and what it was not, because the drama here is not what you might expect. This was not a meltdown. Nothing exploded. No one was hurt. The tension in this story is not catastrophe. It is disillusionment. The contractors actually cleaned the deposit out of the core and drew up a plan to keep it from building up again. But by that point, the larger verdict had already come down from above. The Atomic Energy Commission had concluded that organic-cooled reactors were, as a whole, a technological dead end, that the coolant's tendency to break down would always mean extra cost and extra maintenance, and it decided to stop funding them before the decade was out. So the city of Piqua was left facing a simple choice. It could buy a one-of-a-kind reactor that the federal government itself no longer believed in, or it could walk away. And it made the only rational decision available. The atomic city declined to purchase its atom. In 1966, after barely 3 years of operation, the reactor was shut down for good, for reasons that the official record lists, almost gently, as economic and technical considerations. And this is where the heart of the story begins, because when you shut down a nuclear reactor, you cannot simply lock the door and walk away. The core has become radioactive. So between 1967 and 1969, the plant was decommissioned, the fuel was removed, the oily coolant was drained out. Most of the radioactive material was packed into 55-gallon drums and shipped away to distant burial grounds, to Idaho, and to a site called Maxey Flats in Kentucky. But the reactor vessel itself, a steel tank 27 feet tall, along with the other components that were too radioactive and too awkward to move, was not hauled off anywhere. It was sealed in place, filled with sand, capped with concrete, and buried exactly where it stood. In the government's own chosen word, it was entombed. The atomic city's reactor was given a tomb on the bank of the Great Miami River, and the town simply went on living around it. And there is a quieter part of this that deserves to be named. Working around an experimental reactor, a novel design that was fouling itself with irradiated films of coolant, was not a risk-free job. Decades later, the federal government formally acknowledged as much. The Piqua site is a covered facility under a federal program that compensates nuclear workers who later became ill, and it carries a designated cohort for those who worked there during the decommissioning years. There is no horror story attached to this. It is simply a sober, documented admission, written into federal law. The people who ran and then took apart the atomic city were exposed to something the country later decided was worth compensating. For more than 30 years after that, the town lived quietly on top of the tomb. It used the old buildings for offices and storage, while the federal government monitored what was sealed beneath. And then, in the 2020s, the government came back, not to remove it, to bury it deeper. And what happened at Piqua in 2023 tells you something important about how these stories really end, which is that mostly they do not. In 2018, the city of Piqua told the Department of Energy that the upkeep on the old site was costing far more than anyone had expected, and that it no longer wanted the buildings. So beginning in 2022, the DOE demolished them. The auxiliary building came down, and the reactor dome itself, the visible landmark of the atomic city, the structure that had housed the whole dream, was torn down as well. But the entombed core underneath was not touched. Instead, it was sealed even further, enclosed beneath a fresh concrete barrier 10 feet thick, and the surface above it was paved into a plain lot for the city to use. The dome vanished. The tomb got deeper. That is the entire shape of what happened. The monument was erased, and the buried part was reinforced. And you can verify every piece of this yourself, because for a supposedly forgotten story, the paper trail is remarkably open. The Department of Energy's Office of Legacy Management keeps a public page and fact sheet for the Piqua decommissioned reactor site, describing precisely what remains buried, the entombed vessel, a few kilocuries of radioactivity, and the institutional controls that keep the ground from being disturbed. And there is a lesson sitting in that document that applies far beyond Piqua. When a site is described as cleaned up and closed, that almost never means the material left. It means the material was contained and handed to a permanent caretaker. The Library of Congress holds the full engineering record and photographs of the plant, made before it was demolished, so you can actually see the reactor that is now underground. The American Nuclear Society published a detailed history of it. There is even an original Atomic Energy Commission promotional film about the plant, which means you can watch the atomic city sell its own gleaming future, in its own words, from the 1960s. And the Ohio Historical Marker, erected in 2024 by the Office of Legacy Management itself, is a primary source in its own right. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that a federal cleanup office is now in the business of putting up roadside history plaques about the things it guards. So here's the reframe. When you read the government's own file on Piqua, the key word is not removed, and it is not gone. It is entombed. The Atomic City's reactor was never taken away. It was buried, monitored, reburied, and paved over. And the documents that prove all of it are public, plain, and quietly astonishing. The tomb is not a secret. The tomb is a fact sheet, which points to the mistake almost everyone makes about a story like this. People assume the interesting question is why the reactor failed, the sticking control rods, the oil that turned to varnish. But the failure was ordinary. Experiments fail all the time. That is what makes them experiments. The genuinely strange and lasting question is not about the 3 years the reactor ran. It is about the centuries after it stopped. Do the arithmetic that nobody in 1956 sat down to do. The Piqua reactor operated for about 3 years. It has now been buried, sealed, and monitored for nearly 60. And it will have to be watched over for very much longer than that, effectively without end, because the material entombed inside that vessel will remain hazardous for a span of time that utterly dwarfs the entire life of the project. A town said yes to the atom for a single decade of optimism, and in exchange it acquired a permanent obligation. A thing in the ground that will outlast the city's power company, outlast the historical marker, and quite possibly outlast the memory of why it is even there. 3 years of electricity, bought with centuries of stewardship. That is the real trade the Atomic City made. And it is more or less the trade the entire early atomic age made, mostly without noticing it was making it. There is a deeper idea buried here too, in every sense. Piqua is a small, clean illustration of a choice the whole country faced, and keeps facing. What do you actually do with a nuclear reactor when it dies? You have 2 real options. You can take it completely apart and ship every radioactive piece somewhere else, which is enormously expensive and, in the end, just moves the problem to a different patch of ground. Or you can do what was done at Piqua and at the Army's base under the Greenland ice and at reactors around the world. You entomb it, you seal it where it sits, and you promise to watch it. And entombment is not a solution in the way we normally use that word. It is a decision to contain a problem in place and to hand the watching over to the future, to people not yet born who will inherit a sealed vault beside a river and a federal file explaining what must never be dug up. This is not abstract either. The tomb at Piqua sits about 120 feet from the Great Miami River, in a valley with a flood history serious enough that dams and levees were built upstream years ago specifically to control it. That 10-foot concrete cap, poured in 2023, is in large part the government's answer to the obvious question of what keeps the river and the buried reactor apart over the very long run. And the honest way to hold this is neither alarm nor a shrug. Every regulator involved states that the entombment is safe and protective of human health and the environment. And the entombment also has to be actively maintained, inspected, and monitored, potentially forever. Because safe here is not a permanent condition. It is a managed one. Both of those things are true at the same time, which is, in the end, the recurring truth of nearly every one of these stories. So what is the atomic city really hiding under its quiet parking lot? Not a disaster. And not, in truth, a secret, because the fact sheets are right there for anyone to read. What it is hiding is something more ordinary, and somehow more unsettling than either of those. It is hiding the bill. Piqua is what the shining nuclear future actually looks like once the shine has worn all the way off. Not a mushroom cloud, not a meltdown, just a quiet town that took the deal, enjoyed a few years of being special, of being the atomic city, and then paved over its reactor and agreed, on behalf of everyone who would ever live there afterward, to watch the grave in perpetuity. The atomic city is not a cautionary tale about catastrophe. It is a cautionary tale about how long forever really is. The reactor ran for 3 years, and it will be dead for thousands. And the town's true legacy was never the electricity it made. It was the promise it can never stop keeping. So come back, at the end, to that ordinary lot from the beginning. The person who parks there or drives past it on the way to the wastewater plant is not missing some dark and buried secret. There is a historical marker a short distance away that tells most of the story to anyone who stops to read it. What they are missing is only the strangeness hidden inside the ordinary. That the flat, forgettable ground in front of them is the final resting place of a genuine piece of the atomic age. That a small Ohio town's decade of believing it had caught the future is now a sealed steel vessel under 10 feet of concrete, tended quietly by the federal government, and will be for longer than anyone can truly imagine. They called it entombed. And by now, that word should sit differently than it did when we started. It is a word for the dead. And the government chose it correctly, because that is exactly what happened here. The atomic city did not dismantle its dream, and it did not carry it away. It buried it in place on the riverbank and built a parking lot on top. The tomb is the monument. The absence is the marker. You do not need to travel to Ohio to see any of this. Open the Department of Energy's Office of Legacy Management page for the Piqua site and read the fact sheet. It is short and calm and thoroughly bureaucratic. Notice the phrase long-term stewardship, and notice that it carries no end date because there isn't one. Then go and find that old Atomic Energy Commission film about the plant and watch a proud little city in bright, hopeful 1960s color promise itself a limitless future. Hold those two documents side by side in your mind, the cheerful film and the endless fact sheet. That is the whole atomic age, compressed into 2 pieces of paper. The promise that lasted 3 years, and the responsibility that never ends. And if a reactor sealed into the ground and monitored forever sounds familiar, it should, because you have seen it before, on a far grander and far stranger scale. Frozen into the Greenland ice, the United States Army built an entire city powered by a nuclear reactor and then walked away and left it buried, certain the ice would hold it forever. It will not. The ice is melting, and it is carrying that entombed secret back toward the surface. That is Camp Century. And that is where to go next.